Hi, I'm Victoria. I'm a child psychiatrist and parent coach, and I'm also a mum. And I've been doing a series of videos really with different things to help parents out. Recently, I've been doing some videos around COVID, but I think it's been important to really think about what's been happening in the world when it's come to the events that's been happening in the States. So today I'm going to be talking about something a little bit different. I'm going to be talking about how to speak to your child about race. And it's not really that I'm going to be giving you instructions about it. I just really wanted to reflect on my own experience of speaking to my daughter about race and racism, which really I've been doing ever since we've been talking at all, because it's something that's always come up in our lives quite a lot. So I wanted to share my experiences for anyone who's maybe worried that the children are too young to talk about it, or that it's difficult to talk about in an appropriate way, just to tell you what I've done and how it's worked out for me and what kind of response I've got and whether my daughter's got it. So hopefully it will feel a little bit less daunting for people who are really wanting to do it but are not sure kind of how to start. If you do like my videos, please do subscribe to my YouTube channel, or please like my Facebook page, because I do put the videos out, and recently more kind of blog content as well every week on these pages, so that you'll be able to be first to see them. And for anyone who wants to join my email list, I always send out something a little bit extra in my emails, either like an extra tip or like a free video that I don't put out anywhere else. So I'll put a link up in the description so you can subscribe to that and get the extras. If you're ready to have a listen to what my experience has been of talking to my daughter about racism, then please stay tuned. So for me, when I'm talking about controversial topics with my daughter, a lot of it is often about being as factual as possible, really. So maybe not giving her my own opinion about things, but telling her a little bit more about the facts of whatever she's asking about. And when it's come to race, I guess it's really natural for kids to notice that people look different. They have different hair, they have different colour skin, and those conversations start to crop up about what that's called. What is skin color called? What's this business with being white or being black? And why do people even say that when clearly skin isn't that color at all? That was just something that very naturally came when my daughter was seeing a variety of different people saying, why is it that some people are called that? And those friends that we have, are they black or are they white? What does it mean? And for me, it's been very easy because I've been really talking to her about genetics and saying, well, the colour of your skin is dependent on the colour of your biological parent's skin. And really, that's the only thing it means. Whatever colour skin you have is just a reflection of what your biological parent had or how those things have mixed. And she's quite often created kind of her own names. And often, if she's describing someone to me now, she won't say like a white person or a black person. She'll often say, and this person has skin that's similar to the color of some other friend that she has, because I think for her she prefers to tell me kind of in more depth almost what the shade is, rather than just it being white or black. She wants to sort of say, well, it looks a bit like this other person I know, which for me I think is a really good starting point, because first of all it introduces that wide variety. People do look very different, and we often talk about that. Actually, that was always one of our conversations about any kind of physical attributes, whether that's skin, hair, any kind of disabilities, or anything really, or stature, or whether people are thin, or whether they're a bit bigger. It's always about, well, people are different and that's just how it is, and that's a good thing about the world. So really embracing that kind of variety and just noticing it, not pretending it's not there, noticing and saying, yeah, that person's skin color is really like our friend so and so. Yeah, or this, they do have this really different hair. Isn't it great that different people have different hair? That everyone looks a bit different. Wouldn't it be boring if we were all the same and all had the same background and all looked the same? So for me, those conversations have been happening really, as I said, as early as possible, because certainly my daughter's come across people from all sorts of backgrounds from a very young age. And, when they're very little, they will sort of point and say, well, that person looks really different. And often if they haven't seen, for example, a black person for a while, even when they're young, they'll just forget that they've seen that before. So it will kind of almost be you having that conversation again. But I think it's, again, just important to say, yeah, that's kind of that, yes, that skin colour is different. That's cool. and be very matter of fact about it. So that's the kind of factual conversation I've had with my daughter, very specifically about, skin color and any other, like, as I say, physical attributes like hair color, and eye color that often come along with that. And one of the reasons that I think kids often ask a lot about that is because basically the brain likes shortcuts. The brain is receiving like loads and loads of information all the time, and it wants to filter things out, and it wants to kind of group things together so it makes it easy to make sense of the world. That's what the brain really likes to do. And I think for younger children, so the younger the child is, the more it wants to do that. Actually, really young children really struggle to categorize. They'll often struggle to categorize things by anything other than one attribute. So, even with things like shapes, if you get a very small child who's sort of 2, they'll really struggle to categorize things into, red stars. They can find red shapes or stars, but red stars, is too much information for the brain. They can only really have one thing in their mind. And then obviously as children get a bit older, they can hold more than one attribute and start to sort of categorize things into different places. But the brain really loves to find ways of doing that, because essentially it's like a shortcut to interpreting your environment. And I think one of the reasons that children ask about things like race, for example, is because they're trying to sort of place it. They're trying to attach something to it. So, if this person looks like this, what does that mean? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Does it say something about them? So they're naturally looking for something to explain, what the difference is and what that means for them, like what should be their reaction. And I think that's why it's really important to sort of stay away from that. And I think that's always been for me. My daughter often asks me, well, does that mean that person's come from Africa, or does that mean, that this person comes from Asia, for example, when she's seen people with different coloured skin. And I've always been really open with her and said, in our current situation, it's very difficult to tell anything about a person just by their skin colour, because, they might have only just arrived from Africa, or it might be that very, very, very distant relatives, came hundreds and hundreds of years ago to live here, and anything in between. And there isn't really a way of necessarily guessing that. They might tell you when you're speaking to them about that, but there isn't a way of assuming anything about anyone just because of what they look like, or what colour their skin is. You can make some inferences about some cultural things. So if there's any like religious garments they're wearing, they might tell you something about their religion. But ultimately, it's really hard purely on skin colour to really say anything about anyone. And those questions have come up lots and lots of times, because it is really natural for children to want to put something in a box, in a shelf. It's really, really natural for their brain to want to do that. So it's almost like constantly saying, yeah, it doesn't really tell you anything about them. It tells you a bit about what their parents' skin color was like. That's about it, really. It doesn't really give you much information. So I think that's, for me, has been a way of opening my daughter's mind up, maybe, to kind of be curious about people, individually as they are. And I know a lot of the things I've been reading about people, saying they really don't want children to be kind of colourblind or being brought up as colourblind, and why that's not helpful. And I think to an extent it is important. I think that's like a later stage discussion to have. I think for early years children, really, I think just introducing the idea that colour doesn't tell you really much about a person, it is important, because then you're sort of saying, please don't start attaching lots and lots of different things to it. I think the historical stuff is probably a little bit difficult to digest really, really early on. Though I think really by the time they kind of have, kids have better speech, or certainly sort of 4 and 5-year-olds, you can start to have those complex conversations about that. And personally, I found that easiest to do through, either reading things or watching things, or basically through some kind of story, because I think on its own, it's quite a tricky thing to have. But if certainly someone has experienced that in your circle, any kind of discrimination against them because of their skin colour, or if it's a story that you end up reading that's specifically for kids, or, in my case, watching, for example, Hairspray. My daughter was really into musicals and watched Hairspray, and there's if you wanted to, there's quite a lot to talk about when it came to racism and the civil rights movement, and that's something I did have a conversation with her, and we watched it several times over, and kind of went through different bits of what was going on and why that kind of segregation occurred, and really challenging it with them and saying, what do you think that's okay? Do you think it's okay for people to do that? And then currently I don't I'm finding that most children kind of know, certainly at that age, sort of at 5, 6, 7, they sort of know that it's not okay to bully people or be horrible to people because they're different. So it's often quite an easy way in, again, just to help them make those conclusions for themselves, that actually it's not okay for that to have happened. And I think flowing on from that, there can be that conversation around, well, can you understand why sometimes that might be affecting people now, or like why they might be worried it happens again, or if it is happening again? And that certainly, in more recent events, we're seeing and hearing about experiences that people have that are still not very equal, and that it's not just something that's kind of in the distant past. We know that one of the best ways to really help young people be open-minded and children be open-minded is through exposure. It's actually through experiencing different cultures, experiencing people from different backgrounds, even better if they also speak, other languages, and really coming from a very different place. Because actually, once people experience that diversity firsthand, it's not just something they read about in a book, it's not just something they kind of see on the telly, but they've actually got real actual friends or people they know who come from those different backgrounds, then I think it becomes a lot easier for them to see all people as people, rather than trying to put them into some kind of category, and appreciating that there are differences and kind of being open to things more. And some people will have the opportunity and will have a very different variety of friends, and for some people that really won't be something that they can do. And I don't think we should be sort of forcing our children to have specifically friends from different ethnic backgrounds, if that's if they're not the people they particularly like for whatever reason. But certainly, if they do have friends who are like that, really encouraging them to kind of be part of that, be curious about their culture. But even if there's not really that opportunity, there just, there's some locations in the UK that still don't have a lot of people from ethnic minorities, for example. So even kind of exposing them to a different culture through whether it's food or music or stories or just any other way is still really important, that it just becomes that it becomes normal for them to see different people, to hear about different ways of thinking. And I think for yourself to be curious about it. I'm personally really curious about all kinds of cultures. I think it's really interesting, because the more we kind of see and hear and understand, the more enriched we become ourselves. So it's almost helping them really develop that way of thinking. In the way that kids develop a way of learning, it's also helping them actually develop a way of being curious about what's different, about variety and about different cultures, and instilling that belief that there is valuable things in all cultures, really, that we can learn something from the different people that we meet. So for me, it's not always just about making sure they understand each culture differently and they have loads and loads of exposure. It's about having some exposure, but also really teaching them that curiosity about the world, about other people, about people doing things in different ways, and why that's important. And of course, as children get older and they become teenagers, and they're really starting to develop their kind of moral ways of thinking, so they're starting to align their thoughts through different levels. So initially aligning them to the people around them, but then actually potentially going on to challenge people around them, or challenge the prevailing thought patterns. They will be really relying on you to have knowledge and to kind of guide them in what they should know. So in many ways, you have to be fairly knowledgeable about the world in order for your child to be interested in that and to understand that variety is important. Because I think the more that you understand about history and how it affects people now through what's happening, the more you can help your child think about that and kind of direct them really to consider that. Because obviously, especially teenagers, they're trying a lot of different thinking patterns out. They get really great at reasoning through things. That's one of the reasons they love arguing, is because they like to kind of reason through different thoughts in order to identify the ones that make the most sense for them. And they need you to be there to kind of bounce ideas off. And of course, the more the easier it's going to be for you to create something very multidimensional for them, because they'll have an idea and you can bounce something back, and they'll bounce something back again, and you can challenge it, or you can tell them about something else that to kind of expand their worldview. And they'll be, of course, talking to a variety of different adults. And again, if they can have different adults in their lives who can help them think about different aspects when it comes to race and ethnicity, it's perfect scenarios when they actually learn from different people. But in the absence of that being possible, if it's not something they particularly have an opportunity to do, then actually you have to kind of be fairly clued up yourself. You might not know everything about every culture, but you can be clued up about history. You can be clued up about the things that are affecting the world now. And I think the more you know, the easier it is for you to help your child think about things. And certainly for older children, that's really the really important work, because they will already have you know a set of beliefs, but when they get to teenagehood, they will start challenging some of those. They'll start to think through some of those, and is being able to capture that and being able to contain it. Sometimes teens will go through thinking quite extreme things, for example, and I think it's part of the developmental process. And in order to challenge that in a helpful way and to help them kind of move their thoughts to something that is more aligned to your own values, it'll be important to be able to kind of tolerate them perhaps moving to an extreme and then bringing them back, and having those that knowledge and those arguments at the tip of your tongue, so that you can help them rethink things if they are sort of heading in what doesn't feel very aligned to your own values. The really good thing is that we know that actually teens are largely aligned to the values of their parents, even though most teenagers would say that's not true. But actually lots of research suggests that the vast majority do really hold the values of their parents, even if they're not particularly willing to admit it. So what you think and what you know will really impact them. So any work you do on yourself around that will come back to your child. And I guess for me, that will be the next step of thinking my daughter about these things, is exploring maybe some of the more historical stuff and kind of thinking about what's happening now and connecting the two together, and being able to have a kind of thought-provoking conversation around that, and about why those things are not okay and what can be done about them. So those have been really my experiences of talking to my daughter about race and racism and how I've handled it. I'm not saying it's the only way to do it, or anything like that. I know there's lots of different ways of approaching this sort of stuff. Some of the things I've talked about I've also come across in other places, which has been heartening for me, because I guess it's helped me reflect that some of the things I've done have obviously been suggested as well in the current climate, which is helpful. So as I said, this is just a very personal video in many ways, and if there's anything else that you'd find helpful at this difficult time, or you think something that I'm not right about, please do let me know. It's always good to get some feedback about things.